The first sign that something was wrong came exactly 43 minutes before my daughter walked down the aisle. I remember the time because I looked at my watch when a young man in a black security suit stopped beside my chair and cleared his throat. "Sir, are you Mr. Daniel Harper?" His voice was polite. Too polite. I looked up from the wedding program. "Yes." The young man hesitated. Then he glanced toward the center of the ballroom, toward the family table, toward my future son-in-law. And suddenly, I knew this conversation was not going to end well. "I'm sorry, sir. There seems to be some confusion regarding seating arrangements." I followed his eyes. At the far side of the room stood my future son-in-law, Ethan Reynolds, 31 years old, wearing a custom tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. He was staring directly at me. Not smiling. Not waving. Just staring. Like I was a problem that needed to be solved. I slowly folded the wedding program. What kind of confusion? The security guard shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I've been instructed to move you to another table." I looked around. The ballroom inside the Grand Monarch Hotel held nearly 400 guests. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling 3 stories high. White roses covered every pillar. A live orchestra was rehearsing near the stage. Everything about the room screamed money. A lot of money. And every single detail had been paid for by someone Ethan believed was a broke failure. Me. I nodded slowly. "I see." The guard looked relieved. As if he expected me to argue. As if he expected embarrassment. As if he expected anger. Instead, I smiled. Not because I was happy. Because at 62 years old, I had learned something important. The loudest person in the room usually knows the least. The quietest person often knows the most. And this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. My name is Daniel Harper. I was 62 years old on the night my daughter's wedding nearly destroyed one family and revealed the truth about another. If you had met me that evening, you probably would have believed Ethan's version of me. Most people did. I wore an ordinary dark gray suit. Not designer. Not custom tailored. No luxury watch. No flashy jewelry. No expensive sports car parked outside. I looked like a retired accountant. The kind of man people forget 5 minutes after meeting. And that appearance had been carefully cultivated over nearly 3 decades. The truth was much more complicated. But to understand why a sealed envelope changed an entire wedding reception, you need to understand how my family learned to underestimate me. It started when I was 9 years old. My father owned a small machine repair shop in Ohio. Nothing glamorous. 3 employees. 1 aging building. 1 rusted pickup truck. My mother taught elementary school. We were not poor, but we watched every dollar. I still remember a summer afternoon when my older brother Michael convinced our cousins that I was useless. I had spent 3 weeks building a wooden treehouse behind our grandparents' property. Every afternoon after school. Every weekend. Every spare minute. When it was finished, everyone admired it. For exactly 1 day. Then Michael climbed into the treehouse and announced to the entire family that he had helped design it. Suddenly, people congratulated him. Not me. I remember standing there listening, waiting for someone to correct the mistake. Nobody did. Not because they were cruel. Because they expected competence from Michael. They expected nothing from me. That moment taught me something dangerous. Recognition and contribution are not always connected. Sometimes the person receiving credit is simply the person people expect to succeed. I carried that lesson into adulthood. By 24, I had earned an engineering degree. By 28, I was managing industrial projects. By 32, I had founded my own manufacturing consulting company. The business started with 2 clients, a borrowed office, and $12,000 in savings. 5 years later, we managed logistics systems across 6 states. 10 years later, our software was used in more than 200 manufacturing facilities. 15 years later, I sold majority ownership of the company. The transaction value exceeded $80 million. Almost nobody in my extended family knew. That surprises people. But wealth has an interesting effect on relationships. The moment some relatives discover you have money, every conversation changes. Every favor becomes larger. Every expectation becomes heavier. Every gathering becomes a negotiation. I had seen it happen to others. I wanted no part of it. So I remained Daniel. Quiet Daniel. Simple Daniel. Reliable Daniel. The man who drove an old truck. The man who wore inexpensive clothes. The man nobody considered important. It worked for almost 20 years. Then Ethan entered our lives. My daughter Emily met Ethan during a charity event in Chicago. She was 27. He was 26. Both ambitious. Both intelligent. Both incredibly driven. Emily inherited my patience. Ethan inherited something else. The need to win every room he entered. At first, I liked him. Most people did. He was confident, charismatic, articulate, the type of man who remembered names, the type of man who shook hands firmly, the type of man who could convince strangers they were already friends. But confidence and arrogance are cousins. And over time, I began noticing small things. The way he treated waiters. The way he interrupted people. The way every story somehow became about him. Most importantly, the way he measured human value. For Ethan, success was visible. Expensive cars. Large homes. Designer labels. Executive titles. Public recognition. If achievement could not be photographed, he struggled to believe it existed. That worldview explained almost everything that happened later, including why he believed I was a failure. The misunderstanding started innocently. 3 years before the wedding, Ethan visited our home for Thanksgiving. At dinner, someone asked about careers. My brother Michael proudly described his regional sales position. My nephew discussed his startup. Several cousins shared promotions. Then someone turned toward me. "Daniel, what are you doing these days?" I shrugged. "A little consulting." Technically true. The room moved on. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Except Ethan. "What kind of consulting?" "Manufacturing systems." "Oh." That was all he said. But I saw the expression. Disappointment. As if he had expected something larger. Something impressive. Something worthy of attention. That expression appeared again and again over the next 3 years. Whenever business came up. Whenever investments came up. Whenever success came up. Eventually, I realized Ethan had created an entire story about me. In his mind, I was an average retired consultant. Financially comfortable, perhaps. But ordinary. Harmless. Forgettable. A man whose best years were behind him. And because I never corrected him, that story hardened into certainty. The irony was almost funny. Emily knew the truth. Of course she knew. She had grown up watching the business evolve. She understood every sacrifice, every risk, every success. But Emily had inherited another trait from me. Privacy. She rarely discussed family finances, especially with Ethan. That decision would eventually create consequences neither of them expected. About 18 months before the wedding, planning began. And that is where the real trouble started. Because luxury weddings reveal people's priorities. And Ethan wanted perfection. Not happiness. Perfection. The venue budget alone exceeded $300,000. The floral arrangements cost more than my first house. Guest gifts. Custom menus. Imported decorations. Private transportation. Everything expanded. Every month, another expense appeared. Then another. Then another. One evening, Emily called me. Her voice sounded tired. "Dad, what's wrong?" She laughed weakly. "I think weddings make people crazy." I smiled. "They do." There was a pause. Then she said something that stayed with me. "Ethan keeps saying this wedding needs to prove something." I sat quietly. "Prove what?" "That we've made it." That sentence told me everything. Because weddings should celebrate relationships. Not status. Not victory. Not image. Relationships. Unfortunately, Ethan saw things differently. And the closer the wedding came, the more obvious it became. To be continued. A few weeks after that phone call, I began noticing subtle changes. Not in Emily. In Ethan. The closer he got to the wedding, the more he treated the event like a corporate product launch instead of a marriage celebration. Every conversation revolved around impressions. Which guests mattered? Which guests could create opportunities? Which guests deserved special treatment? Which guests should be seated where? I listened quietly. Because sometimes people reveal themselves when they think nobody is paying attention. One Saturday afternoon, I visited Chicago to meet Emily for lunch. She looked exhausted. Not unhappy. Just drained. Wedding planning had become a second full-time job. We sat near a window overlooking the river. Halfway through lunch, she put down her coffee. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think I'm making a mistake?" That question immediately got my attention. I leaned back. "What kind of mistake?" She stared at the table. "The wedding. Not the marriage. The wedding." Important distinction. I waited. Eventually, she continued. "It keeps getting bigger. Then make it smaller." She laughed. "I've suggested that. And Ethan says we've already committed." I nodded. People often confuse commitment with momentum. Once a train starts moving, they assume it cannot stop. Even when it's headed toward a wall. "What do you want?" I asked. Emily was quiet for several seconds. Then she smiled sadly. "I wanted something simple." That answer hurt more than I expected. Because Emily had never cared about luxury. As a child, she was happiest building forts in the backyard. Reading books. Camping. Volunteering. She valued experiences. Not displays. Yet somehow she had become trapped inside an event that reflected someone else's priorities. Still, she loved Ethan. And love makes people compromise. Sometimes wisely. Sometimes not. The wedding continued. The guest list eventually reached 387 people. Nearly half were business associates. Industry contacts. Investors. Clients. People neither Emily nor Ethan spoke to regularly. But according to Ethan, appearances mattered. Then came the first direct insult. 3 months before the wedding. A family dinner. Nothing dramatic. Nothing public. Which somehow made it worse. Several relatives were discussing retirement plans. Someone mentioned investment returns. Then Ethan looked toward me. "So Daniel, when did you retire?" "A few years ago." "Must have been difficult." I smiled. "What?" "Stepping away when things never really reached the level you wanted." The table became quiet. Not silent, just uncomfortable. Like everyone sensed something strange, but couldn't identify it. I studied him. For a moment, I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. He genuinely believed I had failed. Not because he had evidence, because he had assumptions. And assumptions often feel like facts to people who never question them. "What makes you think that?" I asked. He shrugged casually. "You know." "No, I don't. Most consultants keep working because they need to." A few cousins laughed nervously. Emily immediately looked embarrassed. "Ethan." "What?" His tone suggested innocence, as though he couldn't understand why anyone might object. I simply took a sip of water. No offense taken. And I meant it. Because insults only hurt when they reveal something you fear might be true. This wasn't true. It was simply ignorance. The conversation moved on. But that moment mattered. Not because of the insult. Because of what it revealed. Ethan didn't just misunderstand me. He had built an entire hierarchy in his mind. And he had placed me near the bottom. Months passed. Then came another incident. This one involving the wedding planner. Her name was Claire. 38 years old. Extremely organized. Extremely professional. The kind of person capable of coordinating hundreds of moving pieces without showing stress. One afternoon, she called me unexpectedly. "Mr. Harper, I hope you don't mind." "Not at all. I wanted to confirm a detail." "What detail?" "A payment." That immediately caught my attention. "What payment?" There was a pause. "The final venue installment." I frowned. "What about it?" "I'm trying to reconcile records." I stood from my desk. Because suddenly, I knew exactly where this conversation was heading. Years earlier, I had created a trust fund for Emily. Not enormous by billionaire standards, but substantial. The trust contained investments, properties, and liquid assets accumulated over decades. One of its provisions allowed wedding expenses to be covered if Emily chose to use it. And she had. Quietly, without discussing details publicly, including with Ethan. "Claire," I said carefully, "what seems to be the issue?" Another pause. Then, "The groom appears to believe he made those payments." I closed my eyes. Not because I was angry. Because I finally understood the scale of the misunderstanding. The venue. The deposits. The luxury accommodations. The transportation. Much of it was being funded through Emily's trust, which ultimately originated from me. Yet Ethan apparently believed he was personally financing the event, or at least taking credit for it. "What exactly was said?" I asked. Claire hesitated. Professional people dislike gossip, especially about clients. But eventually she answered. "He mentioned that certain guests should appreciate the sacrifices he was making." I almost laughed. Not out of mockery. Out of disbelief. The irony was extraordinary. After ending the call, I considered correcting the misunderstanding, then decided against it. Not because I wanted revenge. Because adults are responsible for verifying their own assumptions. And because the truth eventually arrives, whether we invite it or not. The final month before the wedding became increasingly tense. Emily noticed it. I noticed it. Even Ethan's parents noticed it. His father, Richard Reynolds, was an interesting man. A former banker. 70 years old. Disciplined. Reserved. Unlike his son, Richard rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. One evening during a rehearsal dinner meeting, Richard sat beside me. We watched staff arrange floral displays. After several minutes, he spoke quietly. "Ethan admires success." I smiled. "Most people do." Richard shook his head. No, he worships it. That difference mattered. Admiration is healthy. Worship is dangerous. Because anything worshipped, eventually, becomes more important than people. Richard sighed. I worry sometimes. About what? That he sees achievement before character. I looked at him carefully. He wasn't criticizing his son. He was worried about him. Parents often recognize flaws long before others do. They simply hope maturity will fix them. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. The wedding week arrived. Guests flew in from 14 states and 3 countries. The hotel reserved 2 entire floors. The ballroom looked like something from a movie. Crystal, gold accents, imported flowers, live musicians, professional lighting. Every detail polished. Every detail expensive. The morning of the ceremony, I arrived early. Not because I had responsibilities. Because I wanted a quiet moment with Emily. I found her in a private suite overlooking the city. For a moment, she looked exactly like the little girl who used to run across our backyard carrying library books. Then she stood. And suddenly, she looked like a bride. My daughter. My child. About to begin a new chapter. She hugged me tightly. Longer than usual. Dad. Yeah. Thank you. For what? For always showing up. Simple words. But they meant everything. I swallowed carefully. Because fathers spend decades preparing for moments they can never truly prepare for. You don't have to thank me. I know. She smiled. That's why I wanted to. For the next hour, everything felt perfect. The ceremony was beautiful. Guests laughed. Some cried. The vows were sincere. Even Ethan seemed genuinely emotional. And watching Emily walk down the aisle raced many of my concerns. Because whatever flaws existed, the love between them was real. At least I believed it was. The ceremony ended. Applause filled the ballroom. Photographs followed. Then cocktails. Then dinner preparations. By evening, nearly 400 guests filled the reception hall. Music played. Champagne flowed. Conversations echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. For a while, everything proceeded exactly as planned. Then Ethan asked for the microphone. And the night changed forever. To be continued. The first few minutes of Ethan's speech were exactly what everyone expected. He thanked guests. Thanked the venue staff. Thanked his parents. Thanked Emily. People smiled. Glasses were raised. Cameras recorded every second. From my seat at the family table, I watched calmly. Emily sat beside him, glowing with happiness. For a moment, I thought perhaps my concerns had been exaggerated. Perhaps marriage would soften him. Perhaps responsibility would mature him. Perhaps. Then his tone changed. It happened gradually. The way a clear sky darkens before a storm. At first, only a few people noticed. Then everyone did. Ethan laughed into the microphone. You know, planning a wedding teaches you a lot about people. Several guests chuckled. He continued. It shows who contributes. More laughter. It also shows who doesn't. Something inside me became very still. Not nervous. Not angry. Still. Because experience teaches you when a conversation is heading somewhere unfortunate. Across the table, Richard Reynolds slowly lowered his glass. He sensed it too. Ethan looked around the room dramatically. Emily and I worked incredibly hard to create this night. Applause followed. Then he smiled. But some people expect front row treatment without making front row contributions. The applause stopped. Not completely. Just enough. The room shifted. People exchanged confused glances. Nobody knew where he was going. Then he looked directly at me. And suddenly, everybody knew. My daughter froze. I saw the smile disappear from her face. "Ethan," she whispered. But he continued. "When I was growing up, my father taught me that respect is earned." A few uncomfortable guests looked toward the exits. Others stared at their plates. Nobody enjoys watching public humiliation, especially at a wedding. Ethan pointed toward me. Actually pointed. "There are people sitting at this family table tonight who have spent years pretending to be something they're not." The room became silent. 400 people. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The orchestra remained silent. The waitstaff stood frozen near serving stations. Even the photographers seemed uncertain whether they should continue documenting the evening. Because weddings are built around celebration. And celebration had quietly disappeared from the room. Not because of the trust. Not because of the money. Because people had just witnessed something far more uncomfortable. Character being revealed. Publicly. And character, once revealed, is difficult to hide again. Ethan stood near the stage, with the microphone hanging loosely at his side. The same microphone that had made him feel powerful less than 2 hours earlier. Now it looked heavy, almost burdensome. Across the ballroom, Richard Reynolds finally rose from his chair. At 70 years old, he moved slowly. Deliberately. The room watched him approach his son. Nobody interrupted. Nobody spoke. When Richard reached Ethan, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold him. That would have been easier. Instead, he looked directly into his son's eyes and asked a simple question. "When was the last time you asked Daniel about his life?" Ethan blinked. "What? When was the last time you asked him about his life?" Silence. Because everyone already knew the answer. Ethan searched for words. Couldn't find any. Richard nodded sadly. "That's what I thought." Then he walked away. No lecture. No dramatic speech. Just disappointment. And somehow, that seemed to hurt Ethan more than anything else that had happened. His mother looked equally devastated. Not embarrassed. Heartbroken. Parents spend decades hoping they have taught certain lessons correctly. Respect. Humility. Curiosity. Grace. When a child publicly demonstrates the absence of those lessons, it affects parents deeply. She quietly wiped her eyes and sat back down. Meanwhile, guests began processing what they had witnessed. Their reactions varied dramatically. Some felt sympathy for Emily. Others felt anger toward Ethan. A few appeared fascinated by the financial revelations. But the majority seemed focused on something much simpler. The unfairness of what had happened. Because most people understand mistakes. Most people understand misunderstandings. What they struggle to accept is cruelty. Especially unnecessary cruelty. Near the back of the room, 2 business executives who had been seated together exchanged a conversation that would later reach me. One of them apparently asked, "Who is Daniel Harper?" The other responded, "The better question is why nobody bothered finding out before tonight." That observation captured the entire evening perfectly. Not who I was. Why nobody asked. Because the problem had never been information. The information existed. The problem was assumption. A dangerous substitute for curiosity. About 30 minutes later, many guests began leaving. Not because the event ended. Because the atmosphere had become emotionally exhausting. People hugged Emily. Shook hands. Offered support. Several approached me. Most said some version of the same thing. "I'm sorry." I appreciated the kindness. But apologies weren't necessary. They hadn't done anything wrong. Around midnight, The ballroom was less than half full. The giant celebration that had taken 18 months to plan was quietly dissolving. Not in anger, in disappointment. The most expensive wedding I had ever attended had become one of the saddest. Eventually, Claire approached me. She looked exhausted. I've coordinated weddings for 14 years. I smiled. And I've never seen anything like tonight. Neither have I. That earned a small laugh. Then her expression became serious. I should have said something sooner. No. Mr. Harper. No. I shook my head. You weren't responsible for other people's assumptions. She looked relieved. Because guilt often attaches itself to bystanders, even when they did nothing wrong. A little later, Margaret Collins joined us. The attorney looked exactly as she always did. Calm, composed, professional, as if she had not just delivered a legal announcement that shocked nearly 400 people. The review process will proceed, she said quietly. I nodded. I know. And for what it's worth, I wish this evening had unfolded differently. That surprised me. Attorneys rarely volunteer personal opinions. I smiled. So do I. Because contrary to what some people imagine, I had never wanted this outcome. I didn't want Ethan humiliated. I didn't want my daughter crying. I didn't want her wedding remembered for legal disclosures. I wanted a peaceful celebration. Nothing more. But wanting and reality are often different things. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, I finally found Emily sitting alone on a balcony overlooking the city. The skyline glowed beneath the night sky. Traffic moved far below. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she broke the silence. I feel stupid. I immediately shook my head. No. I should have seen it. Seen what? She stared toward the lights. How much he cared about status. I sat beside her. The cool night air carried distant sounds from the city. Emily. She looked at me. People don't always reveal who they are immediately. Her eyes filled with tears again. But you saw it. Pieces of it. Then why didn't you tell me? That question deserved an honest answer. Because parents face it constantly. When do you intervene? When do you stay silent? When do you trust experience to teach lessons that warnings cannot? I told you what I saw. She thought about that. Then nodded. Because it was true. Over the years, I had voiced concerns. Quietly. Respectfully. Without ultimatums. Without demands. But I had never tried controlling her decisions. And I never would. Love is guidance, not ownership. Eventually, she leaned her head against my shoulder. Exactly like she had done as a child. For a few moments, we sat there together. Father and daughter. Watching the city. Watching the night. Trying to understand how a wedding had transformed into something else entirely. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. What happens now? I took a deep breath. The same thing that always happens. She waited. People make choices. And choices create futures. Simple. Not dramatic. Just true. The following weeks were difficult. Very difficult. News of the wedding spread quickly through family circles. Then business circles. Then social circles. Not because anyone issued announcements. Because 400 witnesses create a lot of conversations. Every version was slightly different. But the central facts remained the same. A groom publicly insulted his father-in-law. A lawyer revealed the truth. Everything changed. The trust review began exactly as Margaret promised. Professional. Methodical. Unemotional. Several trustees conducted interviews. Reviewed documents. Examined circumstances. Nothing happened overnight. Real systems rarely move quickly. And that was intentional. Important decisions deserve careful consideration. During that period, Ethan attempted to contact me several times. At first, I didn't respond. Not out of anger. Because I needed time. Eventually, I agreed to meet him. Not in an office. Not at a restaurant. At a small coffee shop, halfway between our homes. The place seated maybe 20 people. Nothing fancy. Nothing impressive. Which felt appropriate. When I arrived, Ethan was already there. And for the first time since I had met him, he looked completely ordinary. No performance. No confidence. No carefully managed image. Just a man confronting consequences. He stood as I approached. "Thank you for coming." I sat. "What did you want to say?" For several seconds, he stared into his coffee. Then finally answered. "I was wrong. No excuses. No qualifications. No explanations. Just wrong." That mattered. Because genuine accountability usually begins with simplicity. I nodded. "I know." His eyes lifted. The pain there was obvious. I don't know why I became that person. I considered the question. Then answered honestly. "I think you spent too much time measuring value." "What does that mean?" "It means you learned to judge people before understanding them." Silence. Then he nodded slowly. Because deep down he knew. The signs had always been there. The wedding had simply exposed them. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, neither of us had solved everything. Real life rarely provides neat endings. But something important happened. For the first time, Ethan asked questions. Real questions. About my business. About my life. About my choices. About the years nobody had bothered to investigate. And for the first time, he listened. Not to respond. To understand. That difference changed everything. To be continued. For the next several months, life moved more quietly than anyone expected. People often imagine that dramatic events produce dramatic endings. They don't. Most of the time, they produce paperwork, conversations, reflection, distance, and eventually change. The trust review continued through the summer. Margaret and the other trustees followed the procedures exactly as written. No shortcuts. No special treatment. No emotional decisions. That frustrated some relatives. A few believed Ethan should be punished immediately. Others believed the entire matter should simply disappear. Both groups misunderstood the purpose of the review. The goal wasn't punishment. The goal was protection. There is an important difference. Punishment looks backward. Protection looks forward. The trust had always been designed to protect future generations from poor decisions, financial pressure, manipulation, and unnecessary risk. It wasn't created because I distrusted people. It was created because people are human. Humans make mistakes. Sometimes expensive ones. Sometimes emotional ones. Sometimes both. Meanwhile, Emily and Ethan faced challenges of their own. The first year of marriage is difficult under normal circumstances. Their first year began with public embarrassment, damaged trust, and uncomfortable questions. Neither of them escaped consequences. Emily struggled with disappointment. Not because Ethan had misunderstood my financial situation. Because he had humiliated someone she loved. That wound ran deeper. Trust can survive mistakes. It struggles to survive disrespect. Several times she called me late at night. Not to discuss money. Never money. To discuss judgment. Character. Forgiveness. Questions without easy answers. One evening she asked, Can people really change? I thought carefully before answering. Sometimes. How do you know when it's real? Time. She sighed. That's it. That's it. Because real change is boring. It isn't speeches. It isn't promises. It isn't dramatic declarations. It's consistent behavior, repeated over months and years. Anything else is marketing. And Ethan understood that. To his credit, he never demanded forgiveness. Never asked people to forget. Never tried rewriting history. Instead, he started doing something far more difficult. He listened. The first sign came during Thanksgiving, nearly 11 months after the wedding. Our entire family gathered at my brother Michael's house. 32 people attended. Children running through hallways. Football playing on televisions. Food covering every available surface. Normal family chaos. Years earlier, Michael would have dominated every conversation. He loved attention. Always had. But age had softened him somewhat. And after the wedding, even he seemed more reflective. At one point, several cousins began discussing investments. The conversation naturally shifted toward business. Someone asked Ethan for advice. A year earlier, he would have spoken for 20 minutes. Instead, he surprised everyone. You should ask Daniel. The room became quiet. Not awkward. Surprised. Ethan smiled. Seriously. Then he looked toward me. He's forgotten more about business than most of us know. A few people laughed. Others stared. Because the comment wasn't performative. It wasn't exaggerated. It was sincere. And sincerity has a different sound. You can hear it. Michael looked at me. Then at Ethan. Then shook his head. You know, this family really is terrible at recognizing people. That earned laughter. Even from me. Especially from me. Because Michael had accidentally summarized 40 years of family history. Later that evening, he pulled me aside. I owe you an apology. I raised an eyebrow. For what? He laughed. How much time do you have? Then his expression became serious. When we were kids, I already knew where he was going. The treehouse. He nodded. The treehouse. I smiled. I remember. So do I. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. I spent years assuming you'd always be there. That sentence carried more weight than he realized. Because underestimation isn't always cruelty. Sometimes it's familiarity. People stop noticing what has always existed. Not because it lacks value. Because it feels permanent. That Thanksgiving became one of my favorite family gatherings. Not because anyone praised me. Because people finally seemed curious. Questions replaced assumptions. Conversations replaced judgments. And curiosity is the foundation of respect. A few months later, the trust review concluded. Margaret called me personally. The board reached a decision. I wasn't nervous. Just curious. What did they decide? The original protections remain. I nodded. Expected. Then she continued. However, the trustees also noted significant evidence of accountability and behavioral improvement. That surprised me. Not because Ethan didn't deserve it. Because trustees rarely include personal observations. Apparently, his actions over the previous year had mattered. A lot. What does that mean? I asked. It means the review is closed. Simple. Professional. Final. No winners. No losers. Just a conclusion. When I informed Emily, she cried. This time from relief. Not sadness. Relief. The kind people feel when uncertainty finally ends. A week later, Ethan called. I heard. Yes. Long pause. Then, thank you. I smiled. I didn't make the decision. I know. Another pause. But thank you anyway. That conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet it said more than many 2-hour meetings. Because gratitude sounds different after hardship. Less polished. More honest. About 18 months after the wedding, another milestone arrived. Emily and Ethan announced they were expecting a child. My first grandchild. The news reached me on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Emily showed up at my house, carrying a small gift box. Inside sat a tiny pair of baby shoes. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Some moments are too important for immediate words. This was one of them. Eventually, I managed. Really? She laughed through tears. Really? I hugged her, then immediately started worrying. A standard grandparent reaction. Apparently unavoidable. 9 months later, my granddaughter arrived. 7 pounds. 6 ounces. Perfect. The first time I held her, something shifted inside me. The way it shifts for many grandparents. Suddenly, the future becomes tangible. Not theoretical. Not abstract. Real. A tiny human being depending on choices made today. That realization changed how I viewed everything that happened at the wedding. Because one day, my granddaughter would hear stories about our family. She would learn about successes, failures, mistakes, achievements, and eventually, she might hear about that wedding. If she did, I hoped she learned the correct lesson. Not that money matters. Not that legal documents matter. Not that public humiliation creates justice. The real lesson was simpler. Never assume you understand someone based on appearances. That lesson would serve her far better than any inheritance. 2 years after the wedding, an unexpected event occurred. I received an invitation to speak at a national manufacturing leadership conference. More than 2,000 executives attended annually. The organizers wanted a presentation about long-term business strategy. Normally, I declined speaking engagements. This time I accepted. Not because I wanted recognition. Because I had finally reached an age where sharing experience felt worthwhile. The conference took place in Chicago. A large ballroom. Bright lights. Hundreds of attendees. Ironically, not unlike the wedding venue. Before the presentation began, I stood backstage reviewing notes. Then someone approached. Ethan. He was attending as part of his company's leadership team. Dad. The word still sounded slightly new coming from him. I smiled. Hello. He looked around. Nervous. Which surprised me. Then he said, Can I tell you something? Of course. He took a deep breath. The wedding was the worst night of my life. I remained silent. Then he continued. But it might have been the most important. I studied him carefully. No performance. No audience. No advantage to saying it. Just honesty. I spent 30 years thinking success meant being the smartest person in every room. He shook his head. Turns out it means knowing when you're not. For a moment, I saw the man he was becoming. Not perfect. Nobody is. But better. Wiser. More grounded. The kind of improvement that matters. The conference organizer signaled that my presentation was about to begin. I stood, straightened my jacket, and prepared to walk on stage. Then Ethan smiled. Good luck. I laughed. I don't need luck. No. He grinned. I guess you don't. As I stepped onto the stage, more than 2,000 people rose to applaud. Not because of wealth. Not because of the trust. Not because of the wedding. Because of decades of work, nobody had noticed when it was happening. Recognition often arrives late, sometimes very late. But when it finally arrives, it tends to be quieter than people imagine. Standing there beneath those lights, I thought about the treehouse, about my brother taking credit, about family assumptions, about wedding speeches, about sealed envelopes, about lawyers, about second chances. And I realized something important. Every family operates like a system, not a single event, not a single conflict. A system. Patterns repeated over years. Roles assigned without discussion. Assumptions accepted without evidence. Stories passed from one generation to the next. The danger comes when people stop questioning those stories. Because systems can make us blind. They can convince us we already know someone. They can prevent us from seeing growth, achievement, wisdom, pain, or value. The wedding didn't create our family's problem. It exposed it. The real victory wasn't that the truth came out. The real victory was that people finally became curious enough to listen. And curiosity changes systems. One question at a time. One conversation at a time. One relationship at a time. If you've stayed with me this far, tell me in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to learn your real story? And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.